Hello, my name is Anne. Welcome to my channel In Search of Wonder, and today I have thoughts. Welcome to another installment of my series, for lack of a better word, of videos or type of videos that I like to do on occasion called Deep Thoughts, where I ramble and discourse with you via the comments about various books or thoughts that I have in regards to reading or possibly other subjects. Today, I am tackling a pretty weighty and large topic of what makes a book a great book. Yeah, it's a big one. It's just something that I have been thinking about a lot and contemplating a lot about recently. It's on my mind. So this video is an attempt for me to sort through my varied thoughts on the subject and kind of create some mental structure that I can hang different thoughts on and kind of like think out loud to get a little more clarity in my own mind. And also to bounce off these ideas off of you and to get some other perspective. And so yeah, so the idea of what makes a book a great book. I have hung out in a wide variety of literary circles, virtually, online, and in real life. People who are largely elitist and prefer to read only intellectual things, including fiction. They stick to pretty highbrow literary fiction, classic fiction, etc. And I have also hung out with and have many friends who are basically the opposite and prefer more formulaic type stories and are just reading for the fun of it. They have no interest in being intellectually challenged in their reading material. It's just entertainment for them. And then you have everything in between. And if you asked each of these people, they would probably have a different definition of what makes a book great. If you read through reviews on Goodreads or Amazon or whatever, you will definitely see that everybody has a different idea of what it is that makes a book great in their opinion. Why they give this book 5 stars, but that book only 1 star, and what makes the difference between the two of them widely varies between people. But I think that there are also some objective qualities that everybody can agree on as far as, what makes some books better than others and what might make a book rise to the level of actually being great. So that's kind of what I want to think through today, and just this whole concept of art critique. Like I talk about it a lot in my music classes with my middle schoolers. The objective qualities that you can rate music on as being good, bad, or indifferent, or whatever. And the same thing applying to literature, or any art really. Like these are, I don't know, this is just a topic that interests me, that I have read some about, I have thought a lot about, and I just have a lot of thoughts about it. So to start with, I feel like in the world of fiction, so nonfiction aside, that's not what I'm really talking about. In the world of fiction, I feel like there are basically 2 types of books. And obviously within each of those types of book, vast amount of genres and other categories. But if you just take a step back and look like big view picture, what big picture view, whatever, there are basically 2 types. There are books that are more about the idea, and then there are books that are more about the story. So generally speaking, the books that are more about the idea are considered more literary, while the books that are more about the story are more of your just everyday reads, and don't get into that, elite status of being literary. So you have books that start with an idea, or the idea is the driving force behind the book, and then you have where more of the plot is the driving force of the book. And I think a lot of people would automatically say that the idea-driven books are the great books. And I don't 100% disagree with that. But I think there's a lot of shade and nuance in between that can affect the objectivity of that. So first of all, what I mean by like a book that is idea driven rather than plot or story driven, and that is like where the author starts with an idea and the plot is secondary to his idea. And the idea could be a question that he has, that he's, you know, working through, trying to find the answer by playing it out in a variety of ways among his characters, and the things that they experience in the story. Or there's a theme that he just wants to explore. Or maybe the author feels like they have an answer to a question that everybody asks, and they want to illustrate, you know, what they believe that answer to be through the characters of their story. So an example would be like Pride and Prejudice, for example. So my son, as many of you know who have watched my channel, he, for his freshman literature class, read Pride and Prejudice, and he had to write a paper about it. And there were multiple topics that he could choose, but the one he chose was, what is Jane Austen saying about marriage in this novel? And a lot of people, if you ask them what the theme of Pride and Prejudice is, or what idea is Jane Austen exploring, they would play off the title and say, well, Pride and Prejudice, which is exemplified in the two main characters. But that's not really the main thing she's exploring, or the big thing. She's exploring marriage, what makes a good marriage going into it, or once you're in it and you can't step out of it, how do you make it good? Or can you make it good? Or are some marriages doomed from the beginning? And she asks questions about through her characters in the story, she asks questions like, what makes a good marriage? Is it equality in class? Or is it equality in intellect? Or is it equality in character? What is the key element that is necessary to have a good marriage? Is it communication? Is it sticking to your role? Is it simply a matter of security for the two partners, securing their station and their livelihood? She explores all of these questions through like so many characters in the book and their marriages, and the marriages that are contracted during the course of the book, or the marriages that are already in existence and being portrayed. And that is the idea and the theme, the questions that Jane Austen is asking and exploring primarily in this book. And part of it, where the Pride and Prejudice come into play, is how Lizzie and Darcy, they both have flaws in their character, but they are humble enough, they are humbled through the story to see their flaws and to acknowledge the flaws in themselves, to regret them and to be willing to change, and also to be willing to accept the flaws in the other person. And I think with the example of Lizzie and Darcy, Jane Austen is setting them up as an example of an ideal marriage situation. They may not necessarily be equal in their class and societal stature, but they are equal in character, they're equal in intellect, and more importantly, they have the humility to acknowledge their own flaws and the grace to forgive each other's flaws and to be able to work past them. And in another one of my favorite novels, Les Miserables, Victor Hugo is exploring so beautifully the juxtaposition of justice and mercy, and the playing out of that in a variety of ways, but most spectacularly through the two main characters, Jean Valjean and Javert. And really to great effect. I mean, it's a very powerful story in his exploration of those themes. And another common theme that you find in many books, especially classic literature, and the longer I was seeing and thinking about it, the more I was like, wow, this is a very, very common theme, an idea that is explored in a book. And that is childhood versus adulthood, or childhood growing into adulthood, and that moment, that precipice where someone grows from being a child into being a fully grown adult, and what that means and what it looks like, what is good about it, what is bad about it, what is difficult about it, all different shades of it, looking at it from the perspective of an adult, looking at it from the perspective of a child, looking at it from the perspective of someone who's going through that, who's walking through that. So many stories are consumed with this idea and are written with this idea from the front. So these are just some ideas that are behind many of the stories that we read and that we love. So that would be my thought of a book. Probably more would consider a literary type book that is idea driven. What idea is being explored here through the characters in the story? The thing about an idea driven book is that the plot is secondary. The plot is the servant, is subservient to the idea. So the plot and the characters all have to fall in with whatever idea is being explored. So if it is not done very deftly, it can come across as very awkward and the story not as enjoyable. The characters may not be realistic and it might fall flat. Or it could be clumsy, or the idea could be so obvious, then it becomes like, kind of like more preachy or whatever. So there are dangers of like the idea driven one there, and there's all kinds of range of well done types of that literature versus very poorly done. And then we have the plot driven books, which I would venture to say are by and large often the most popular. I mean, classics stand the test of time and people read them and enjoy them and love them. But, and literary fiction as well, many people read it and love it. But by and large, generally speaking, it is much easier to read a plot-driven story because you're not having to look at a sort of like shadow story that's happening also. You're not having to dig a little bit deeper to understand, why is this character doing this? What is happening? It's really more just about the plot. It's more surface, so it's easier to understand. You don't have to think too much about it. And there's definitely a solid place for that, even though I have been in circles where, more elitist intellectual readers would look down on that sort of thing. But I think it's important to have a good mix. And I think that plot-driven stories can say things in their own way, in maybe in a slightly different way and maybe more approachable way than the heavier hitting, more idea-driven, loftier books. So a plot-driven one, it's not that it can't say important things. It's not that there aren't any ideas. It's that the ideas are subservient to the plot, and the plot is foremost. The structure of the story, what is happening to the characters, who the characters are, all of those are more important than whatever themes or ideas are being explored in this story. And sometimes it can get a little bit tricky to differentiate between those two. And there are some books that kind of like, in a Venn diagram, they're kind of like in the middle there, in between the two, kind of having qualities of both of them. And so it can be a little bit subjective as a reader to look at it and say, which is the case here? Is this more idea driven or is this more plot driven? It's not always like super clear cut and dried. And certainly many plot driven books still explore themes and ideas, themes of marriage, themes of relationships, themes of honesty or integrity, etc. So you have all kinds. And within each type, there are common elements that belong in every story. And another thing that makes a book great or not is whether those elements are well executed or not. So let's start with characters. For example, the characters in this story. And this is a very loaded subject that I feel like could be a totally separate video because there's so much to it. Many people will dislike a book or consider a book not to be a good book because they don't like the characters in it. But if it's an idea-driven book, the characters maybe purposely are not likable. because they are subservient to the idea that's being portrayed. So it may be that you're not supposed to like the character. They are serving a role in the exploration of the idea. Like Mr. Collins, for example, in Pride and Prejudice, he is not a very likable character at all. But he's not supposed to be. He is part of the whole exploration of the idea of, you know, what kind of character, what kind of person contributes to a good marriage or not. And just looking at different types of those kinds of people. Also kind of exposing the other thing about characters, and again, this could be a whole video in and of itself, is that many times, like in the one, you know, my example about Mr. Collins, the flaws of a character are magnified to expose the flaws of our own character. And we may not all be Mr. Collins, but we may have elements of Mr. Collins in us. And when we look at characters in a story, we should see them as, or they should be, not we should see them as, but they should be accurately reflecting the reality of human character and aspects of human character. Now, sometimes, like Charles Dickens, for example, his are kind of caricatures. There are people in his stories that they're exaggerated and their flaws are exaggerated. And so he's like putting a magnifying glass on this flaw in humanity, and he's saying, you know, this is a character flaw here. Look at this. Look how ridiculous it is when you see it magnified as being the defining characteristic of this person. So characters in a story, they can be good characters, they can be bad characters, they can be likable. You might hate them, but that doesn't necessarily make or break the book. In and of itself. I think the main thing that will make or break a book as far as the characters go is one of two things, let's say. There may be more, but one of two things that come to mind. And one is that they are inconsistent. Either the character is inconsistently, like they behave shyly in this instance, but then in this instance, they're bold and stepping forward. And there's been no reason between the two to create the change, and then they're back to being shy again here. Like they're just inconsistent in the way, in their personality and the way they are portrayed. And you know, sometimes they speak this way and then sometimes they speak that way. Are humans actually inconsistent? Yes, we can be inconsistent. I can be shy in some situations, but I have no problem with public speaking. So that may seem like an inconsistency in a book because it needs to be a little more linear. Like we need to be able to see a little bit more clearly the person's overall personality. So if there's too much shade and variation, then it's hard to get a clear picture of what the person is like, the character is like. So inconsistency in the character is a big flaw in a book and keeps it from being great. But also lack of character development or growth. So if a character, if the protagonist in the story, the main character, if their behavior is awful and they are doing things that are just wrong constantly, or that, you know, as the plot of the story is developed, whatever they're doing is unlawful or just straight up wrong or unkind or immoral or whatever, and yet that is never addressed in the story as being a flaw, then that's a problem. The character, or if it's addressed as a flaw, or if it's, you know, you're being told that it's a flaw, but it never changes, nothing ever happens to that character to make them grow, and their character never develops, then that is also a flaw. So any flaw that a character has should be pointed out as a flaw. The character should undergo some development over the course of this story, just to show that, you know, highlighting what characters should or should not be. Otherwise, it's a morally ambiguous story, and personally, and this, I'm bringing my worldview into this, which I'll talk about in a minute, but personally, that's not a good story. You want a story that is reflective of what is good and true and beautiful. And if it's not elevating those things ultimately by the end of the story, then it's a flawed book, and it's not a great book, in my opinion. And then besides character, you have the plot. That's the actual storyline and what happens. And plots are all over the place. Like, there's every kind of plot in the world. And some of them are far-fetched, some of them are simple, some of them are daily life sort of things. Some of them are confined to one day, some of them are epic and spanning decades, some of them are confined, geographically to one setting or happen all over the world. Plots all over the place. Some of them are believable, some of them are completely unbelievable. And none of that really matters too much, I don't think, in the grand sense of things, except for if it is a realistic story, like it's not set in a fantastical world and the characters are not, any kind of exaggerated caricature type characters, but they're supposed to be real people living real life, doing real things, and yet it's, this completely unbelievable plot. It's a little bit harder to call that a great book. Like, the plot has to be consistent with the characters in the setting and the genre. So, yeah. And then, like, for something like historical fiction, if you mess too much with actual history and you're not upfront about that, like there's a new subgenre of fantastical historical fiction, when they do bend history on purpose to explore what if questions. That's a perfectly legitimate. But if you're trying to straight up explore an actual historic event and write a story about it to highlight it, then you want to stick to the plot that has been predetermined by history, what actually happened. So there's a lot of room for variation in plot. The biggest thing is, but this ends up being very subjective, is if it draws a person in or not. Like if it's enough to keep them going and keep them turning the pages and seeing what happens. And this is very subjective. But generally speaking, like there has to be an element of a problem or a question that needs to be answered, or some sort of obstacle to surmount or whatever by the characters. There has to be a problem, for lack of a better word. And then through the course of the story, the characters have to be able to overcome that problem. Otherwise, you don't have a story. If there's no problem, there's no story. I see people sometimes in groups that I'm in asking for recommendations of books where, there's no stress and there's no angst and nothing bad happens and everybody's happy. I'm like, why read a book? Like, I mean, that just sounds unutterably boring to me. Like, why? I don't understand. But anyways.
That was kind of a rant.
To each their own. We all have different preferences. So another thing that can make or break a book is the setting. And sometimes the setting is a huge part of the story, and sometimes it's the background of the story. And a lot of times the more literary a book is, the more the setting is important, because the setting is part of what is exploring the idea. But again, the setting is subservient to the idea. It's sometimes less important in more plot-driven fiction, unless the setting plays a large part in the twists and turns of the plot. And, a lot of, let's say, contemporary rom-coms, it doesn't matter if they're happening in, this big city in the world or that big city in the world, not too much difference. Like, it's not going to play a huge difference in the role, the setting per se. However, like city versus country would play a big difference in how the story plays out. So, so setting can make or break a story, depending on if it's used effectively or not. If the setting is communicated effectively or not. Like, honestly, I feel like a lot of classic literature, in my opinion, is not as strong in this. Like, even though they sometimes have like long descriptions of the scenery, I don't necessarily feel immersed in the setting personally. This is just an opinion. But that just means like that the setting is not necessarily vital to whatever idea is being explored. It's not necessarily a huge part of it. And then you have books like Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, where the setting, like Gothic stories, the setting is incredibly important. The house itself that, where things are happening, is definitely a huge part of the story and adds to the exploration of the idea and the development of the plot and how it affects the characters and the way they behave and why they behave certain ways. Anyway, so setting is another one. And then the use of metaphor. Generally speaking, the more metaphor there is, the more it's likely to be a more idea-driven book than a plot-driven book. But again, there's all kinds. What makes or breaks this is how well it's used. I feel like it shouldn't be pointed out. I have read books where, more, plot-driven books where they utilize metaphor in the story, but then they point it out. Like there's a sentence in the narration that draws a line between, like, it being a rainy day, for example. Like, it's a rainy day. And then it adds a line saying, something like her heart felt as gloomy as the day. Okay, I'm not an author, so that was horrible. But you know what I mean? Like, it draws a connection from the metaphor to the reality of what the person is experiencing. I feel like that's a little clumsy. Like, the metaphor should just be there, and whether you catch it or not, it should just be there, creating the atmosphere in the story and lending to the story, but not overtaking the story, if that makes sense. And you shouldn't interrupt the narration to say, hey, look, did you see that metaphor I put in there? Did you see it? I don't know. Then it's clumsy. So I feel like that can take away from a book being a great book or not. Or if they're so obscure that nobody can catch them. I mean, I think generally speaking, as a culture, we don't see as much in analogy and metaphor as prior cultures did, because we don't value that as much as prior cultures did, and we are much more practically minded and concerned about reality and what is in front of us and what is fact and what is true. So I think we have lost a little bit of the ability. So this gets iffy, but some books can be so obscure that it goes, or it's so metaphor driven that the story suffers because of it. And then you have the prose or the narrative style, and that could be as technical as, like, is it first person, third person? Is it omniscient or limited to, one or two different perspectives of characters in the story? Is it told from the perspective of a character not in the story, or from one of the actual characters? There's a lot that goes into the narrative choice. And then also the style of the prose. Is it more lyrical? Is the author utilizing the language, the medium of their language, as part of their exploration of the idea? Or are they merely, I say merely, but it's not to put it down, or are they utilizing language simply to tell the story that is being told, and the language that they're using takes a back seat to what is actually happening on the page? And both of those can be true for both types of books. But generally speaking, more elegant prose is probably going to be in a more literary style fiction, when the author is much more careful about the words that they choose as they tell the story, and the way they are connecting those words together, and whether it is more poetic or lyrical or elegant or just straightforward, is all part of the idea that they're exploring. And it tends to be a much more important element. But there can be literary works with straightforward prose that's not particularly elegant, or even particularly unique in any way. The prose is secondary, is becoming secondary to whatever else is happening in the story. But a plot-driven story is more likely to be more straightforward prose, and not quite so, not so much emphasis on the sentence structure and the crafting of it. Definitely still some attention. The more attention is paid to it, the higher it rises in quality, and the more skilled the author. But again, there's some subjectivity there. And then all of this is what can make or break a book is the execution of all of those things, the combination of all of those things, and how the author is able to present them to the reading audience. And if it's effectively communicated, if the story is effectively communicated, if the ideas are effectively communicated through the execution of these different elements of story. And then all of that stuff is combined to make a book a great book or not. And then, here's where it becomes really subjective. All of us bring to each story that we read, we bring ourselves to it. And we can't help it. Like, we bring our mindset, we bring our perspective, we bring our worldview, we bring our upbringing, we bring our beliefs, we bring our histories, our past, we bring our upbringings. We bring all of that into a story. We can't escape it. And it affects how we see the story. And that's why you can have two different people rate a book either 5 stars or 1 star, and have completely different perspectives on it. It may be that the book is either great or horrible objectively, but each of them is seeing it, is applying to the book their own experiences and seeing it through their own perspective, and it's giving something different back to them. And some books are really polarizing in that way because, this half of the population can see what the author's trying to do and appreciate it, and this half just doesn't see it and doesn't understand it, doesn't get it. And so then that does beg the question, is it a great book or not? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that question. To sum up, I guess the greatest books. Now, a book can be a great book, but I feel like the greatest books, taking all of this into consideration, are the books that have an idea, that are exploring an idea, whether they're idea driven or not, doesn't necessarily have to be the case, but it should have an idea or a theme that is being explored, whether it's idea driven or plot driven. And the idea should be clearly communicated. And there's a little subjectivity here. Like I said, some people can see what's being communicated and some people don't see it. Did the author do their job if it's not clearly communicated? Or is it just that the people reading it are uneducated and lacking the perspective? It's a good question. And then there is the idea, the next thing is, in order to have a great book, then it should have an exciting, intriguing plot. And by exciting, I don't mean that it needs to have, building is blowing up and people calling the cops and people in danger for their lives every 3 seconds. It doesn't have to be like thrilling in that way. It just, or like, something's happening all the time. It just has to be interesting and exciting enough to keep, like, the person is excited to read more. Like, I want to find out what happens to these characters. What decisions are they going to make? What is going to happen as a result of the decision that they just made? And is it going to end well, or is it not going to end well? Or this looks like it's going to end very badly. How is the author going to work these things out? What is going to happen to resolve this? So a person a really good book keeps the person reading, keeps them invested and interested in the story, in the plot, and what is going to happen in the story. And then I think a huge thing is that the characters need to be realistically, consistently drawn. And they don't have to be all good people, and they don't always have to do the right thing, but they have to be realistically drawn, and there has to be good character development. Whatever flaws the character might have. If it's an issue of flaw, then the flaw needs to be improved on. Maybe not perfected, but improved on. And when it comes to the narrative style, there should be an appropriate narrative style for the type of the story that it is. Like, the two should work together. And I think there's room for like so much variation. Like, I think one author could write the same story with 2 different narrative styles. In my opinion, they could probably write it just as effectively in either one, personally. But I think there also is certain stories work better first person, and certain types of stories work better first person, and certain types of stories wouldn't work at all in first person. They really need to have a third person perspective. And also, sometimes elegant prose works, but sometimes it just becomes flowery and purple, as they say, and then it gets in the way of the story, and it's not contributing to the story. And it's not contributing to the idea. It's not contributing to anything. It's just there for elegant writing. It's like, okay, just write poetry, okay? Well, yeah, I don't know. just put those beautiful words to better use. Anyways, and then there should be metaphor in a good story. It should have some good metaphors, but I feel like they should be subtle but visible. Like, it shouldn't be in your face, and you shouldn't have to say, hey, look, there's my metaphor. Did you see my metaphor? But also, it shouldn't be so obscure that that it's difficult to see. And also, it shouldn't be heavy-handed. Like, I've read some books where, like, the weather was used so much in the story, metaphorically, that it was just unrealistic. Like, raining, you know, for this part of the story heavily, and like this dramatic storm, and then the very next instant, you know, it's all sunshiny and everything, and then back and forth depending on, you know, how the story is progressing. Anyway, stuff like that, like a little heavy-handed and too much, in my opinion. And then all of this needs to be executed well with a deft hand, and those are the very best books. And then I think that for a book to achieve greatest book status or great book status, it should appeal to wide swaths of people across time and place. It should have universal themes that people can understand across humanity, even if they don't experience the particular time and place being portrayed in the story and the cultures and mores of that time. Like, going back to my example of Pride and Prejudice, you know, most of us don't live in that life, and we don't have that approach to the process of getting married that they had back then. We live in a different time and age when the people that we choose to marry, we choose in a different way than it often happened culturally at that time. And we have a different social class structure, although we definitely still have it. Always will. Like, that's just part of humanity. But the themes are universal. Relationships with other people are universal. Marriage is universal. And the concepts being explored there are universal, and something that all of us can appreciate and understand. So the greatest books will have themes and ideas and concepts being explored that stand the test of time and can be applied to all ages. And by all ages, I mean not necessarily age groups and demographics, but ages of periods of history, eras. So those are my thoughts about, my general thoughts. I think I may do more videos on specific aspects. Like, I think a lot about characters and how people interact with characters on the page. In particular, I think about that a lot. And I think a lot about genres, because genre plays into it too. Except that I didn't mention that in my list of things as far as what makes a book great or not, because I think different genres speak to different things and have the ability to explore different ideas in different ways. And I think that there is room for almost every type of genre that's out there. Well, like, for example, I think that fantasy is very popular because it's much easier to explore an idea in a fantasy world, because you are not confined by reality. Reality is very confining, and it's difficult to explore an idea when you have people who are confined by time and space and a real place, or a place that seems to be real, even if it's, you know, a fake town in Arkansas or whatever. But it still is, it could be a real place. So I think that fantasy has become very popular because it opens up the doors of how you can manipulate characters and plot lines and settings to be subservient to the idea that you have, without crossing lines of creating unrealistic characters or unrealistic plot lines, because you don't have to be realistic. So I feel like that opens up a lot of doors, and I think that's one reason why it's so popular. I personally just prefer like realistic stories, but I can see the value of fantasy. Unlike sci-fi, I think explores a lot of what ifs, and futuristic stories, ask a lot of questions, and also again are not bound necessarily so much by reality and are free like to use imagination a lot more widely and wildly. And then like horror and thrillers, which it's not my favorite genre, because I prefer not to dig too deep into this, but horror I think is able to explore very deeply ideas of the human psyche and what makes people tick, and psychology and everything. And I think that's very valuable, even if it's not something that I want to read per se. Mostly because I don't like to be scared out of my mind. That's why I don't really ride on really crazy roller coasters. Anyway, so every genre has its place, and I think there are examples of idea-driven versus plot-driven in all those genres, in every genre. I think some genres are more amenable, whatever the word is, to literary fiction than not. But anyway, so those are my thoughts. I am curious what your thoughts are after this long rambling video. Do you agree with my thoughts about what makes a novel great or not? How do you approach reading fiction? Do you just take it on the surface for the story it is? Do you want it to say something more to you? Do you prefer idea-driven stories or plot-driven stories? And what are some examples that you think are great books? Anyways, just talk back to me. Tell me what you think. I'd like to hear it. And I will see you next time. Bye.